One of the first things that my screenwriting teacher taught me was that character flaws matter. A good flaw, or flaws plural, can shape the course of an entire narrative, and some of the best stories you know would not have succeeded if one of the major characters didn't have some aspect of their personality that we the audience are meant to dislike. Granted, Mr. S was only teaching me the basics back in high school, but in my experience as a writer since then, I've only become more convinced that making a flawed protagonist is one of the quickest ways to make your story interesting. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. An interesting story can mean a whole lot of different things, and not all of them are going to get you the unanimously positive reception that swindlers will tell you is easy. Truth is, not every flaw is created equal, and the mere implementation of character flaws at all is potentially going to alienate a section of the audience who didn't come to your story to hear about imperfect people making bad choices. You're basically setting yourself up for a whole lot of bad faith readings of your work, and if you're trying to get published, expect a lot of rejection. Though, if you weren't expecting that to begin with, you're probably going to this whole writing thing with delusions of grandeur. So, why make your main character or the characters around them flawed if there's so much risk involved? Well, you shouldn't do it just because some over-the-hill YouTuber said you should. Ideally, the reason you should give your character flaws is the same reason you'd do anything in writing. Because you have something authentic to say about your own lived experience and inner life. The best possible flaws that you can give your characters are harmful tendencies that have impacted your own life directly, usually because you or somebody you know and understand really well has suffered from them. There has to be some level of soul-searching that cannot be imitated from other writers you're merely a fan of, or, heaven forbid, AI writing tools. It's not enough to plug and play with generic antisocial traits and make the character act in a way that you believe is annoying. If you aren't sympathizing with your protagonist at least a little bit, your audience is probably going to notice that you aren't being honest with them. There are few things less appealing than a prospective character who exists to be an avatar of everything the author dislikes. Likewise, you wouldn't want to create an uncritical facsimile of your own values and strengths as a person. That feels cheap and often comes across as heavy-handed. Stories are not like memes, Willie. Nobody cares that you've portrayed yourself as the Giga Chad. Truly nuanced character writing lives in our own imperfections, those bad habits that we can't seem to shake, the negative consequences of our actions, the moments of vulnerability when we become our own worst enemies. Exploring these parts of life can make the text of our stories richer and even help alleviate some of the stresses that lead to suffering in the first place. So, flaws are pretty cool. I think most of us can agree on that, but for this video, I want to go a lot further. I want to talk about main characters who are not only shaped by their many flaws, but are practically overwhelmed by them. These are protagonists who seemingly cannot exist without having something severely dysfunctional about them. They aren't outright evil, of course, that's a whole different can of worms, but the sheer deficiency of their person is often what makes these heroes so memorable, and in my opinion, engaging. What can I say? I'm just kind of a freak like that. How about we get the two massive balls rolling with Beau is Afraid, Ari Aster's sorely underrated third feature, starring Joaquin Phoenix as the afraid Beau himself. When we think of flawed people, mild-mannered and passive Beau Wasserman probably doesn't seem like the worst of the worst. He isn't abrasive or unlikable, and the campy, malicious world he inhabits does a lot to validate his anxieties to the audience and garner our sympathy. There's a vulnerable pathos to Beau, and Phoenix's stellar acting all but guarantees that the emotional and physical pain he endures comes across as authentically felt. Beau is afraid, and the parade of bizarre calamities that make up his everyday life only seem to give him more reasons to be. This constant indignity alone wouldn't be a character flaw, but it's in the way that Beau confronts his biggest problems, or rather doesn't confront them, that we can see where his shortcomings lie. Though a running visual gag is made of the absolute size of his testicles, Beau has neither the spine nor the balls to make choices for himself. In one of her scathing monologues, Bo's emotionally manipulative mother, Mona Wasserman, chastises her son for his perceived selfishness and withdrawn nature. She blames him for leaving his decisions in life up to everyone else, while at the same time scolding him for not being more appreciative of the support she gave him. Are Mona's words abusive and hypocritical? Yes. But is she completely wrong about Bo's lack of initiative? Well, earlier in the film, Bo literally allowed a child to die from drinking paint in front of him, and despite protesting the self-destructive act with his words, never attempted to grab the paint away from her or prevent her from swallowing it. I'm not here to put Bo on trial, the movie itself does that just fine, but I think this example shows that our protagonist doesn't have much of a heroic instinct when it counts. In context, what he did wasn't evil, and it wasn't really his decision, but his failure to save the life of this teenage girl, who was also his metaphorical sister, was definitely a mistake. He has a chance later in the film to prevent another life-or-death situation with a woman his own age, but once again, Bo cannot help but allow others to choose for him, even when it's his own life on the line. It seems that Bo would rather die than inconvenience anyone in any way, a behavior which all but assuredly goes back to the strict way that Mona raised him. Bo wants to be happy, as any of us do, but he'd also like to be the person that doesn't cause harm to others. The utter paralysis he has when it comes to taking charge of his own life means that he will inevitably let everyone down in the end. More than that, he cannot bring himself to love the one person who has had the most effect on shaping his entire life, his own mother. Instead of living an independent life or distancing himself from Mona, Bo chooses to still obey her every word out of a pervading sense of guilt, and this only deepens the hidden resentments which are the catalyst for the film. Bo's Afraid is less a cautionary tale, and more a tale about being too cautionary. The coping mechanisms that Bo believes are protecting him are actually more like a fawn response, an attempt to appease the threats to his being. Mr. Winston Churchill would have some choice words for him, because Bo's shrinking charisma allows one unmitigated disaster after another to befall him as the world takes miles from Bo for every inch he gives. His cowardice comes from a lack of self-esteem, but make no mistake, there are selfish cowards out there too. The Green Knight is a reimagining of the Arthurian legend Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, wherein Gawain is portrayed by Dev Patel as a chivalrous knight only in title. A blood cousin to King Arthur himself, the Gawain we meet before he sets off on his famous quest is a drunken slacker with hardly any ambition beyond bedding his peasant lover Essel. Yet, when an eldritch spirit of Christmas comes knocking at the castle door, Gawain meets his destiny with a vorpal blow. As in the original poem, the unlucky knight is honor-bound to seek out his mean green foe and receive a mirrored strike to his own neck. Except Gawain's head doesn't go back on, meaning that he's more than likely riding off to face certain death. Although the Green Knight is the antagonist and driving force behind Gawain's quest, he makes few appearances throughout the film. Most of the time, the audience is simply following Gawain as he encounters strange and often unfriendly people in his travels. Those who go into the Green Knight expecting some high-octane action fantasy adventure might come away disappointed, as the slow, contemplative pace is more akin to David Lowery's previous feature, A Ghost Story. I personally believe that the runtime allows us a chance to immerse ourselves as deeply into Gawain's journey as the knight himself. Of course, I'm from a generation that actually enjoys watching dark fantasy movies instead of deriding them as
stinky, boring, nonsensical, disconnected poo-poo caca.
But you know what is that? The way that Gawain treats the common people that he supposedly cares about helping. He runs into medieval Barry Keoghan in the aftermath of a massacre where all his brothers were killed, and instead of offering condolences or asking politely if there's an extended cut of Saltburn he can watch, Gawain simply uses the poor boy to get information for his own quest, flipping him only a single coin as a complete afterthought. This comes back to bite him, of course, when the very same peasant and his cohorts rob Gawain in the forest. "'Tweren't enough," says the scavenger, and he's completely correct. Gawain does not do enough for the people he meets, not in words or in actions. While it's true that an ordinary man may be wary of strangers in the fields and hesitate to be charitable, Gawain is expected to be heroic and extraordinary, a great man. His demeanor and morals should be closer to Superman than Bo Wasserman, but frequently they are not. One of David Lowery's most inspired additions to the story was the character of Lady Winifred, a saintly woman who was victimized by a traveling prince who then threw her severed head into the pond outside her residence. Her ghost entreats Gawain for help in retrieving her parted skull, but even in this selfless act, he finds ways to show spiritual weakness. When Winifred first appears to him, Gawain attempts to touch her to confirm whether or not she is corporeal. He doesn't go through with it because she verbally questions him, drawing attention to how rude it would be for the knight to put his hand on a woman without consent. Even though she truly is a ghost and most likely wouldn't be touched at all, her concern at Gawain's lack of tact is warranted. In this instance, Gawain placed his own fear of a perceived spectral entity over Winifred's comfort and his own sense of etiquette. Later, before he dives into the water to find Winifred's head, Gawain asks her what he shall receive in return for doing so. Her answer is unabashedly blunt.
Why would you ask me that? Why would you ever ask me that?
As with the scavenger he met before her, Winifred is right to point out Gawain's selfishness in this situation. She's an earthbound spirit with no ability to make herself whole and must rely on the heroism of a total stranger. And now that same stranger, an alleged knight, wants to be repaid in full for taking a short swim and picking up her skull? It's a ridiculous request that ignores the suffering Winifred has gone through. And at worst, it's practically leveraging her desperation to receive an unspecified favor. Gawain's position in the narrative grants him some plausible deniability when he acts this way, but I'd argue it's the fact that we can almost, but not quite, justify his actions that makes The Green Knight that much more poignant as a film. It critiques Gawain as a person by showing us all the minor lapses in virtue that make him unworthy of his mantle of knighthood, while also letting him get away with these infractions enough that we hope he'll become a better hero in the long run. Though Gawain's fate at the ending of the film is left ambiguous, we are shown in gruesome detail exactly where his most glaring personal faults could have led him. I loathe to make this comparison, but anyone who has ever seen Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog will probably get flashbacks to Everything You Ever. Now the nightmare's real indeed. What I like about both Beau is Afraid and The Green Knight is that while the settings that these men inhabit are filled with danger and cruelty, the worst punishments they receive are usually a result of how they respond to those outside pressures. Giving a flawed character the agency to contribute to their own misery is, in my opinion, important to telling these kinds of stories. In real life, people do often suffer for reasons beyond their control, and while exploring this in art can be cathartic, it runs the risk of making the protagonist feel non-specific to the events of their own story. Moreover, experiencing bad outcomes or feeling negative emotions shouldn't be seen as a flaw in and of itself, lest we demonize individuals merely for not leading ideal lives. For a truly inactive character to work as the lead, there usually needs to be another prominent character who serves as a dramatic foil to them, the dynamic character. The dynamic character in these stories is often everything the main character isn't. Active, confident, outgoing, and usually more in control of the direction life is taking them. They may even threaten to steal the spotlight away from the main character altogether, overwhelming the narrative with the force of their personality. The 1974 adult animation film Cheap had its name changed to Dirty Duck and later Down and Dirty Duck because the dynamic character of the Duck, an oversexed knockoff of Disney's Donald Duck, was significantly more marketable than ineffectual wimp Willard Eisenbaum, the quivering white scribble whose bizarre journey to carnal success is chronicled in this picture. Though Dirty Duck has enjoyed some cult classic status over the years, and I myself find it rather charming at parts, it's not something I can really recommend to most people on account of how much of its humor is based on minority stereotypes. The plot of the movie itself, if you can call it that, is a confusing barrage of harebrained schemes and violence that somehow results in Willard finally achieving enough post-nut clarity to get his life in order. This might just be one for the freaks and the freaks alone. Just watch Mike and Melissa if you want a tamer version of this same concept. Both are basically propaganda for mediocre guys to shack up with whatever flavor of furry waifu their unconscious mind is shitting out. You might notice that I haven't included any films where a woman is the flawed protagonist yet, and the reason for that is that the general threshold for which female characters are seen as exceptionally flawed is a lot lower here on this platform compared to my own standards. Don't get it twisted, I can support some women's wrongs, but I don't want to get bogged down in the pretense that Diane Nguyen, or Skylar White, or Avatar Korra are anywhere near the same level of pathetic disgrace as Willard, Gowan, or Bo. So, instead of doing that, I'm going to talk about a leading lady who is actually a total mess from a movie that happens to be one of my favorites of all time. I've wanted to talk about Colossal on this channel ever since it was released back in 2016, and as far as you know, this is the first time I've done it. Nacho Vigalando's black comedy kaiju movie stars Anne Hathaway as Gloria, an unemployed writer whose lack of success in her field has driven her to heavy drinking. Her dependence on getting wasted to make it through the day damages her relationships, and, after her boyfriend Tim throws Gloria out of the New York apartment, even threatens the lives of other people on a massive scale. Due to a traumatic event involving her childhood classmate Oscar, Gloria has become a monster, or rather, whenever she walks through a certain playground in her hometown at a specific time of the day, a Godzilla-esque creature manifests on the other side of the world and mimics her every action. Before discovering her connection to the monster, Gloria thought she was the biggest victim of her own drunken stupor. As the accidental death toll in the ground zero of Seoul, South Korea rises, Gloria must confront the wide-reaching implications of her negligent behavior and begin a difficult path towards getting sober and making amends. Her redemption is contested as she falls deeper into a controlling dependency on Oscar, who, despite growing up to be Ted Lasso, has effectively remained frozen in time since he was a boy, never being able to grow out of his resentment and envy towards Gloria's supposed merits as a creative writer. The vice grip that Oscar has on Gloria only tightens when he becomes aware of his own monstrosity, a giant robot that remotely answers to him in the same way that Gloria's does. From the dramatic midpoint twist onward, Colossal lives up to its name as it scales the results of Gloria's character flaws into a battle between giant monsters. The high stakes are made personal as she finds out the hard way that not facing your own demons can be harmful to everyone, not just yourself. It's a movie about taking responsibility for your place in the world, and finding out that for better or worse, your choices do matter. I think a lot of us writers have a tendency to fool ourselves into believing that a character's flaws should be an afterthought. We're often bombarded by doubts about whether or not our work will reach its intended audience, and these insecurities might compel us to make everything as appealing as possible, even if it means scrubbing away nuance to cater to expectations. The characters that I highlighted in this video are not the norm, and by definition that means that they aren't for everyone. There's always going to be that portion of the mainstream audience that wants unambiguous good guys versus unambiguous bad guys, as subjective as that is. But that's okay. Art wouldn't be art if some of it didn't make us uncomfortable or challenge our default perspective. Stories about flawed people, especially flawed heroes, can do a lot more than affirm our biases. They can help us confront our own imperfections and humble us in the face of our own failures. Putting aside the way that it might affect the audience, giving the main character of your story even one serious flaw can go a long way towards making them multi-dimensional, which, from my experience, will make those characters more fun to write about because you'll know them better. There's a sentiment among my own writing peers that great characters are built through dramatic contradictions, and what is a flaw but a contradiction between action and better judgment? Your protagonists don't always have to become better people, but when the flaws you write into them are compelling enough, chances are you'll wind up with a better story. Thank you all for watching this video from We Are Not Alive. If you'd like to hear more from the creative people behind this channel, consider joining our Patreon at the lowest and only tier. If you've made it to the end, leave a comment telling us about your favorite flawed protagonist, or just a character flaw that you love to see represented in fiction. Until next time, we'll be seeing you in the near future.